Hey gang, and welcome back to my scary basement slash studio. It's been a little while since I've gotten to share a new piece with you, and the reason for that is that I've actually spent the first part of 2020 working on my first ever art book, which is going to be launching through Kickstarter within the next 2 weeks or so. If you like my art and think you might want a whole book of it, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell because I'll be posting a launch video when the Kickstarter goes live within the next 2 weeks. Today though, we're going to be looking at my latest painting, Lacing Up, and we're going to be looking at how I painted it. I recorded my entire process from start to finish, except for a few parts where I forgot to hit record or the camera died. So let's jump in and see how I did it. So my process typically starts with small sketches in my sketchbook called thumbnail sketches. These are really small and loose, usually like 1 inch by 2 inches, something like that. And this painting is no exception. I did start in my sketchbook and make a bunch of loose drawings. And then when I had one that I was relatively happy with, I jumped into Photoshop with it, and I drew it again, and that's what you're seeing here. This is my first sketch in Photoshop. And the reason for that jump is that it allows me, for one, to work with layers, have an undo button, so if I mess up, it's real easy to fix. And then, those layers come into play. You can see that I've added value here, and it's really easy to do in Photoshop and not do it in a permanent way, whereas with a drawing, you're kind of hosed if you add something to it and you don't like it. So once I had a drawing that I liked, like this, in this case, I went ahead and started adding color to it. You can also see that I flipped the image, and this is something that I did back and forth while I was concepting this piece. I couldn't decide if I wanted it to face to the left or to the right. But back to the main point, color. Yeah, so once the values are good, then you can start experimenting with color. And one of the things that was really smashed into my brain over and over again in school was that as long as the values are correct, you can pretty much make the colors whatever you want, because our eyes and our brains perceive the light and darkness of something before it addresses the color side of things. So I always try to get the values nailed down first, and then I can just make the colors whatever, typically something realistic, but sometimes not. And as you can see, this painting has a very strong light source over on the right. And I wanted to emulate that in my piece. Now, granted, the subject matter is completely different. But that's really the beauty of looking back at the past and pulling things from it, from an inspiration standpoint, is even though I'm doing these sci-fi paintings of giants and hangars and very contemporary looking stuff, I can still look at an old painting like this and find things that I want to reflect back or be inspired by. So in my painting, the golden light coming from the side manifests as this hangar door going up and allowing sunlight to stream in. And you can see that again here in my digital mock-up. And the digital mock-up stage is the stage right before I actually start painting. So I took my digital sketch that I liked, and I built a set out of cardboard in my studio and hired a model, and she came over and posed, and we shot a ton of photos. And then what I do is I take those photos, pop them back into Photoshop, and then digitally paint around them and on them, sometimes collage in different elements. Like you can see the forklift there is actually a die-cast model forklift that I bought at the hardware store. So I collage and combine and digitally paint all these elements together to get this final digital study. And basically, this is the image. It is the painting that I'm going to paint. And the reason I work this way is because oil painting is time-consuming. The materials can be expensive. There's no undo button, as we talked about earlier with the drawing phase. So I really want to have my creative decisions worked out before I ever actually get to the canvas. And Photoshop is a great tool to do that in. So what I'm doing right now is, and if you've watched my other videos, you already know, but I'm putting down an imprimatura, and now I'm painting a grid on the surface. The imprimatura is just a wash to get rid of the white. And, if you think about it, if you're trying to paint something bright and your whole surface is already white, you can't go any brighter than white. So you actually need to darken the surface in order to paint bright colors on it or to make things look like they're light. And the grid's purpose is to allow me to transfer my digital study from the computer to the surface of my canvas. So I draw a grid on my canvas, as you're seeing me do right now with the ruler, and then I also do a matching grid in Photoshop on the piece, and then I'll copy it by hand from the computer to my painting. I used to do a very detailed digital drawing in Photoshop, and then I'd print it out at FedEx office or Kinko's full size on like a blueprint paper, and then I would do a graphite tracing transfer. But I found that the process of doing a very tight drawing in Photoshop really locked me up. By the time I got to painting, it was too rigid. It felt more like paint by numbers or filling in blanks. Whereas doing it this way, I've got the grid to keep my proportions in check and keep me mostly on the mark, but that little bit of human error, as I'm placing these elements by hand, kind of keeps things fresh, keeps them exciting. It keeps me from feeling like a human printer or a robot. I still, at the end of the day, I want this to be a painting with an organic quality to it. Although I want it to be as realistic as I can make it, I still want there to be evidence of the human hand. I don't want it to look photoreal. I want it to look painterly real. When you get up close, you can see brush marks and strokes and little bits of, fuzz or whatever. Just, stuff that makes it feel like a real painting. So doing this grid method by hand, I found, was a really great compromise between accuracy and freedom. And this also gives me, again, another chance to kind of play with things. If I'm working and I see that something on the grid on the computer is not quite how I want it, now that it's actually on the canvas, which is full size, well, I can adjust it or move it or whatever, and I can play with it a little bit. And that doesn't often happen, but sometimes it does. Yeah. So I'm just painting away here. There's this image in particular, there's a lot of straight edges. There's a lot of drawing involved. So this took me quite a while to block all this in. And you can see here I'm going in with the cloth and erasing some of the lines. And the reason for that is that I don't want the grid to be on there any longer than necessary. If it dries, I'll have to paint over it to cover it. And that means that there's a good likelihood of the grid showing through subsequent layers of paint. Even though you might think of paint as being opaque, and it is pretty opaque, it's not 100% opaque. Some colors in particular, reds especially, tend to be quite thin. And, if I paint over this grid, which is a very regular pattern, it's going to show through the paint under the right lighting conditions or the right angle, and it's going to be distracting from the rest of the painting. So as I draw my design onto the canvas, I go along at the same time and erase the grid lines as I no longer need them. And the grid is evenly spaced and regularly placed on the canvas. So if I accidentally erase a line that I still need, I can always go and remeasure and put the line back. Admittedly, I've never actually had to do that before, but I could if I needed to. Also, once there's a good amount of drawing on there, the grid lines kind of become unnecessary to an extent. Once you've started an arm, you can usually see where it's going to end if you've got the hand started, Yeah, so I try to get rid of the grid as I use it and don't allow it to dry. And there are a few of my paintings, if you look back through my website, MatthewJHuntley.com, or order a book in 2 weeks, that you can actually see the grid line shown through, like on the painting Bulwark, which is of a giant in a ocean storm, and there's a bunch of buoys and stuff. The buoy up in the foreground on the right side of the painting, you can kind of see the grid lines showing through the red buoy. And again, that's what I was saying, red paint tends to be a bit thinner than other kinds of paint. So now in that case, it's kind of a fun thing, because again, it does lend it that painterly quality and that kind of evidence of process where, you get up on the painting, you're like, oh wow, I can see the grid through it. And that moment I kind of liked it, but generally speaking, I don't want it to be there. And the other reason is basically the same as why I haven't drawn the figures in the foreground of the forklift yet. I don't want to paint them and do a really good job of it and then have to paint a background wall or floor around it and have to avoid messing up good work, you know. So it just makes more sense to do important elements last. So with that said, as you can see in the video, I'm still painting in background stuff. And I spent quite a long time on it, longer than I would have liked, but there's, again, a lot of linear elements like these girders and stuff. And I was very concerned with trying to keep them straight and parallel and even. So, I mean, again, being an organic painting, there's going to be a little bit of variation and wobbliness to it. But if there's too much, it's going to look sloppy rather than painterly. So there's a fine line to walk between perfection and organicness that looks good. So I'm going to go ahead and speed the time lapse up here again because there is a lot more background to do. And basically, it's just me painting green and filling in these voids. I'm trying to make sure they're again sharp and straight, relatively so. So I guess now, while we're waiting for me to start the next section, would be a great time to talk about Raid Shadow Legends. Just kidding. Actually, I'm about to start on the left-hand side, and there we go. More earth tones. Yeah, I'm trying to keep the colors of the hanger itself relatively subdued, you know, kind of downplayed. And I'm saving these color pops for the important elements of the painting, you know, so the giant's uniform, the forklift. There's going to be a warning light that's spinning on the wall that I haven't painted in yet. One of the foreground figures is wearing a red coat. You know, I'm trying to keep the color as a way to direct the eye. Same thing with the value. You know, the strong light coming in from under the door kind of acts as a pointer in a way that directs your eye across the image and across all the important elements. You know, it's this nice, strong diagonal. And it's important to think about that kind of stuff when you're composing an image. James Gurney, one of my other favorite artists, he's the guy behind Dinotopia, has a fantastic article about eye tracking. You know, the guy is as much a scientist as he is an artist. He's constantly exploring vision and color theory and the science behind art making and the way we perceive it. But he's got this great article about eye tracking where he took several paintings and he went down to a university somewhere where they had special goggles that could actually track where you're looking. And he found that the eye does not read an image the way we historically thought it did. You know, like, oh, I put this nice line here and that's going to cause my eye to go from here to here and move this way or that. And that's not really how it works, at least according to the findings of James Gurney. Instead, we tend to look first and foremost at human faces, wherever they may be in the work. Following that, we look at the hands because, you know, the hands can communicate almost or just as much as the face, whether it be a nice gesture or holding a weapon or what have you. So the eye goes from faces to hands, and then it goes to points of contrast. So, you know, I talked earlier about the color pops. So if the image is mostly dull, dark earth tones, but there's a contrasting super bright color, it's going to look there. Same thing with value. If the image is mostly dark, but there's a few light areas, it's going to look at the light areas. If it's mostly light with a few dark areas, it's going to look at a few dark areas. So it's a really interesting article that goes very much against the grain of conventional art wisdom. You know, if you look at a lot of art textbooks or go to art school, you know, they tell you, again, that the placement of lines, linear elements, or kind of shapes within a composition can direct the eye. But James Gurney, you know, kind of proves otherwise. It's really interesting. So highly recommend you read that. Really helps inform my work today and the way I compose images. Might help you too. But getting back to the painting, I'm Finally working on the main figure. I've got the entire image blocked in at this point other than the figure. And that's really the goal with this first pass is, yes, I'm trying to paint it as accurately as I can on the first go, but I know there's going to be mistakes and things that I have to correct. So my main goal is really just to get any area of empty canvas covered. And once I've got paint everywhere, then I can start looking back at the image and go, oh, well, this little part here is too dark, this is too light, or the color's wrong here, or whatever, and I can start making corrections. But it's really hard to make a correction if the whole piece isn't put together yet. I don't know, this is probably maybe a stupid metaphor or example, but it's easy to see where a piece goes on a 99% finished puzzle as opposed to one that hasn't even been started or is barely started yet. It's kind of the same thing with the painting. It's a lot easier to see your mistakes with the whole picture in process and put together. And painting the figure is one of my favorite things to do, and that's part of why I leave it for last is, again, what we talked about earlier about painting the background first and all that, but also because if I start off by doing my favorite thing, I really lose motivation to do the other areas of the painting. So doing the figure and the fun bits at the end after all the kind of, not busy work, but the more grueling sections are completed, really helps motivate me to work on the painting. And it's important to strategize about things like that, because, people talk about loving what you do, which I absolutely agree. You need to love your work. But even though I love painting, a large majority of the time, it's kind of dull work, like a lot of the video at the beginning there was just painting in background colors, which is this kind of drab military green. So as much as I love painting, it can be boring and not very exciting sometimes. It's just a matter of one of my other artists I really enjoy, Sam Flegel. His quote is, "It's all about having your butt in the seat," and it's so true. It's just a matter of showing up, doing the work, and putting the time in. And it's not always, crazy inspiration and like, oh my God, I've got this crazy idea or this super inspiring thing. Sometimes it's just like, yeah, I'm just painting walls, painting the floor. So you can see I've painted the whole figure, painted the clothes, going back over the top now. I'm refining all the areas that, when I did the first pass on the skin, either it was inaccurate, needed adjustment, or, after it dries, you can kind of see that it might be too thin. You can still see some of the under bits coming through, and then I'll do a second pass to tighten it up and make it more opaque like we were talking about earlier. And that's really what I'm doing to her outfit right now. Red especially, I can't stress this enough. Red as a paint is very thin, and it needs multiple coats. Otherwise, you're going to see through it, which that might be what you want. But in this case, it is not what I wanted. And then I also waited to do the black outlines on the outfit until I had done the outfit and let it dry, because I want these black details of the outfit to be sharp. And if I do it while the red of the outfit is still wet, it's going to smear and blend into it and make it look dirty. So I had to strategically let those areas dry before I could come back and address them again. You can see I'm just painting those figures right on top of what's already been finished, like I talked about earlier. It is very frightening, but you just got to dive in. You just got to do it. I will do the drawing first in raw umber on top rather than just starting with color for a couple reasons. Raw umber, again, is an earth tone. It dries quickly. It also wipes off pretty well, usually. Again, those chemically colors can tend to stain things, but the raw umber is brown. And her skin is brown. The environment is a lot of earth tones, so the brown blends in perfectly, wipes off pretty nicely. It's a great way to draw in these elements that I'm painting on top of. And then I'll usually use my palette knife and scrape the paint where I know I need to paint on top of. That helps provide tooth. Paint needs something to stick to. If the surface is too smooth, the paint won't adhere properly, and it'll do what's called delamination. So later on, as it dries, it could just kind of pop off or slide off, peel off. And by scratching up the surface, that provides tooth that the paint can kind of grip onto. And now we're jumping into varnish. So varnishing is super exciting and super scary because if you varnish too soon and the paint's still wet, it can cause these wet areas to run and kind of melt. And that's super scary when it happens. It is not fun. But on the other hand, it makes the painting look amazing. As oil paint dries, it tends to dry dead. What that means is the color gets kind of chalky and light, and it just looks bad. And it needs that varnish to make it feel like it's wet again. The varnish also protects the surface. If something, God forbid, gets spilt on the painting, or there's dust or debris, or, I work as an art restoration specialist, so a lot of times I go into homes where there's been fires or floods, and it's really easy to tell the varnished paintings from the unvarnished paintings because the varnished paintings will clean up very easily, whereas the unvarnished ones don't. All those contaminants stick and get absorbed by the paint. So the varnish acts as a shield. So really two processes or two things with the varnish. One, it makes it aesthetically look better, and two, protects the surface. Very important part of the process. But yeah, this is it. Final painting. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. It is super flattering that you find my work interesting enough to sit here and listen to me blabber on about it. So again, thank you. I'd also like to give a tremendous thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. Could not do what I do without you guys. Your support just means the world to me. It is so helpful and awesome, especially, now with kind of the craziness going on in the world. Thank you guys so much. And just one last time, again, I've got a book of my art coming out. It's going to be launched on Kickstarter in about 2 weeks. If you'd like to stay in the loop about it, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell because I will be posting a video with all the details about the Kickstarter when it happens. So thank you again so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great night. Bye-bye.